First of all, I think your analysis was very straight line. History doesn't run in a straight line.
Kid, you cannot tell your neighbor he is stealing ducks when you are stealing fawns.
As High Commissioner, I was wrong. As Akash Persaud, I reacted naturally how any person would have.
I did not come here for that kind of abuse. I did not come here for that kind of abuse. If you're going to go down that road, I'll walk off.
But it's all okay once they're talking. If they were talking, I could not have been here today.
You got ADHD.
I got that.
Calm down.
I think I've done enough in terms of taking our team out of trouble from losing.
Come on, Lou Taylor. That's good. I'm reading the script now, and the first person that comes to my mind to play a detective,
Yes,
but
the
an
Guyanese critic.
erratic
Mikhail
detective,
Rodriguez.
is Mikhail Rodriguez.
Why an African slap an Indian? Why a man and slap a woman? No, girl, how you deal with that? You deal with that.
We must encourage platforms like this because it brings together different people and allows for discussions to take place in our country on a multiplicity of fundamental issues.
Kingdom, you apologizing for something you think I did is wrong. I don't want you to do that, and you should not have done that. Hello there, wherever you are. Welcome to the Freddie Kissoon Show with our reliable co-host, Akash Persaud. This is our independence program, and no more eligible person to have on independence program is a scholar that will look back at 58 years of independence. They're a historian, a social scientist, a sociologist, a political theorist. Those are the kind of people we would like to interview to look back at 58 years of independence. And we have in the studio this evening one of the most accomplished social scientists in Guyana, a man with a number of books to his credit and a relentless debater, polemicist, but most of all, a relentless intellectual contributor to Guyana's historiography. He's in Guyana this evening. He's in Guyana to launch two books among the many that he has written. I'd like to show you the two books that he will be launching in Guyana. It's a powerful Indian voice, Alice Bhagwandin Singh, Reflection of a Work in Guyana. Mistress Singh is the husband of a Guyanese icon, Jung Bahadur Singh, and this is another book by our guest this evening. So he has done a biography of Dr. Singh, quite a Guyanese icon, and his wife. So he's here to launch the book on Alice Bhagwandin Singh and another book he's co-authored. Now, one Dirty Bill, a village in Guyana, the story of Harry Persaud and Persaud Nagar. Now, who in Guyana, from the 10 regions of this country, including Region 11, which is the United States, and Region 12, which is Canada, Region 13 and 14, Barbados and Trinidad, which Guyanese in those 14 regions do not know what is Persaud Nagar, one of the famous districts in Guyana. Here is a biography of the man who started that village. Our guest this evening is someone not shy of controversy, and a controversy is going to swirl all over this country when his next book is released. It's about the Wismar Massacre. I would say the Wismar Massacre is the saddest, most tragic moment in the history of Guyana, dating back to whatever years you want. That remains the most tragic story of the civilization of Guyana. And you can't be faint-hearted to write a book about that. I am not sure if I'm going to read that book, but I have to read it to review it because I am an admirer of the work of BAYTORAM RAMHARACK. But WISMA is coming up, and when that book is finished, if we have to ask passage money to bring BAYTORAM to Guyana to do an interview, we will. This evening, our guest is famous Guyanese social scientist, Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK. I've known him since 1989. That's a long time.
It is a long time.
It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Akash.
Co-host Akash, BAYTORAM, welcome, Guyanese, welcome to 58 years of independence. BAYTORAM, could you take us through the journey? What were the ups and downs? You could be brief, you could elaborate if you want. But what were the ups and downs, trials, tribulations, sadness, optimism, pessimism of 58 years of Guyana? Are you happy with what you see?
Well, before I get to that point, Freddie, I think that introduction was a bit overreaching. I don't think my wife had said so many nice things about me, but I do appreciate it.
Sure, I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't. You're a top scholar. I wasn't.
So that was nice of you.
You could be against what you write, but you cannot deny the man's productivity and his scholarship.
And I also want to thank you for the plug on the book. And the reason I do these things is because, there's a famous book that I would recommend people to read, Silencing the Past, written by a fellow named Rolf Trollo, who was a Haitian anthropologist, who goes into a whole description about how our history is either manufactured or written by people who control power, right? The production resources or the power. But the problem with that is we know who those people were, right? There was the Europeans who established our history, decided which part of our history should be recorded, and so on. So my belief is that we now have to be able to participate in the writing of that history, because it is important, because if we don't, others will write that history for us. And one of the things I can tell you about, I know you're talking about the books here. I've never heard very much about Harry Persaud. I know my brother stayed there when he went to UG. J.B. Singh was mentioned very positively in the Western trial by Chetty. Alice was never mentioned. I started out doing the book on J.B. Singh. He was a ship doctor, right? And he was the person who was able to, in a sense, make cremation official. He was in a committee in the Legislative Council. So he played an important role. He was also, going back to before Chetty, he was also a member of the British Guiana East Indian Association, the premier organization that spoke on behalf of Indians. He was elected 7 times, and one of the things that he was fighting for was the franchise, right? So this is going back before the time of Chetty. Obviously Chetty did a great job trying to get everybody involved in that process. In terms of Alice, his wife, I don't want to go into too much detail because I know you want to talk about.
No, you go. This is your program.
Alice, I was going to do a chapter on Alice Bagwande. She actually was born in Suriname, right? And JB was a ship doctor, as I said. The ship doctor, who would travel on the indentured ship, was an important personnel, because if there's a natural disaster, it's the ship doctor who has to play that role to make sure everything is okay. So because they were going back and forth, he met, Alice, young Alice in Suriname, right? And where they met was an important place. It's the immigration depot, right? In Dutch lingo, they call it Kolie. Kolie, Kolie Depot, in Suriname. They got married in 1910. It's important for us, and this research took me into Suriname. It's important to understand that her father was also very much involved in an organization very similar to the British Guiana East Indian Association, right? And she, as far as I know, Alice, was the first Indian to write an autobiography. The interesting thing about her autobiography is she dealt a lot about her family background, right, going back to India. But she stopped at 1910 when she got married. Most people refer to her writing, 104 pages, handwritten notes, as a diary. But when I started looking at it, this thing in my head was really, it dealt with a lot of her background. So it is an incomplete autobiography, right? She sat down and wrote this on 3 occasions, in 1958, 59, and 61. 3 times, and she wrote that down. But there's some important information about the culture of Suriname, or indentured background. So I was going to put a chapter of her in the J.B. Singh book, but when I started doing the research, going to Suriname and meeting people and so on, there is a story about her that needs to be told, right? We don't have a lot of Indians, especially women, women especially, who play that role. We know very briefly about people like Salamea. We know about Sumintra, who was involved, one of the women who was involved in the 1939 Lenora incident. Lenora was a very hotbed. I think Irfan is from Lenora. Lenora?
Yeah. The finale is from Lenora.
Okay.
Yeah. And his relatives, his parents and grandparents.
Yeah, and of course, we have the people involved in 1964, right? So there's a history here, and I come back to this whole notion of the silencing of history. So we have to dig up these things and be part of the process of trying to recreate. You mentioned Wisma. I do want to say, and it's important for me to say this because one of the things about Wisma is I've interviewed a lot of people. I had an ad in the Starbuck News, and from that, there was a chain reaction of people, who contacted me and so on. And so I've collected a lot of information, but you made the point that you may not read it, but it is a traumatic incident. And my thing about Wisma, like everything about what I'm doing about Indian history, is I use the word on silence, right? There's some stories there people may not know, but there's like a picture. I'll give you one incident, a picture of a lady sitting in the boat when they were, leaving, right after the killing and the fire and so on. Now that baby is now, on the car, right? The car was the boat that brought them out to the Romveld area. That baby is now an adult, and I interviewed the mother who was in that. Nobody knew her name. The name was never mentioned. All they have is a picture of a woman and a baby. When I showed her the picture, she lives outside in a place called White Plains. She almost fell off a chair. And the thing that she said to me was, nobody has ever discussed this with me. Nobody has even brought it up. And there was a powerful phrase that someone else mentioned, another person who I interviewed. He said, it's as if God has forgotten about us. To me, that's an important message, right? All I'm saying, you see, I wouldn't call, and I think, I had a conversation with Sharma, Solomon, Norton, and so on. I'm going to be a little cautious about using the word massacre. I know Chetty refer to Wisma as a massacre. He mentioned it twice when he referred to that event. If you don't like that, then you probably wouldn't like the fact that Janet Jagan, in her resignation letter, used the word Holocaust. Maybe that's a Freudian slip because she's thinking about her Jewish background. To me, in my mind, it's more of an ethnic cleansing because you could have seen that, right? And we know what happened. There's a COI that was done. It's a tragic event, and I don't think we need to go into, looking at other people as being evil who perpetrated that event or treating other people as victims. They are, and it's important for us to understand that despite the tragedy that faced Indians in that event, which I think is silenced because, we do commemorate, and Granger has done a lot to do this, the Son Chapman incident, and rightfully so. But one of the questions I posed to Sharma is why not have, when you make your presentation about Son Chapman, why not mention WISMA, what happened on May 24, May 25th, which is coming up, and May 26th. They say they don't have a problem with that. They just have a problem with the word massacre. I says, fine, we can have, but I see these things as, I mean, it's important for us not to dig up things to create problem, right? I get that. But my thing is, you have to be able to talk about that history. And I come back to what I said about, these folks. We know the name, but I've never read about them in high school. I'm sure you have never either. But it's important for us to put these things out there. You may not like the perspective or and so on. But the point is, if it's there, you can be critical, right, about these things. So that's what I do. If you ask me, what else am I doing? I don't want to make this into a monologue where you can stop me. I spent 2 weeks in England before coming here. And I can tell you, when you look at our history, and again, I'm speaking as an Indian here, right? Some people may say that's a crime. You can't, but, so the one incident that I know that is very traumatic, well, first of all, this is the only place where 2 ships came on the same day, right? So I'm doing a project on the 1913 Rose Hall riot, which is the bloodiest. It wasn't Enmore, it wasn't Devonshire Castle, but that was it, where they brought out the gun, they roll it from Amsterdam and shoot those people. The trial, and I have all the transcript, was reported for 51 days in the Argosy. That was the planters' newspaper, right? Obviously, they were protecting the planters, right? 15 people were killed, and about another 50, if I have my numbers correct, people were injured, and some of the injuries were so dramatic that they had to perform amputation in order to save those people. So, there's a memorial there, but there's a story behind that people don't really know. We know about, and I'm doing something, if you're interested, on the first 2 ships that came, right, the Hesperus, and the Whitby, I used to teach social studies, and we used to look at slave ships and so on, how people, sat, and you always wonder, well, how could they endure that, transatlantic journey? So I'm curious about what the life was. See, we know a lot about what happened before in India, right? What caused them to make that odyssey, right? And we know what happened after they came, but we don't know much about what happened on the ship. The Whitby was 90 days at sea. So how were these people living? What was the boat like? What was it built like? How did they sit? Now for that, we may have to recreate like Gayatri Bahadur did when she did research on her great-grandmother. But it's an interrogation process, and we can take whatever information to recreate that life. Because I think people today are conscious about these things. I know President Irfan Ali, Bara Jagdeo, Bisasar, the former Prime Minister, and Basdev Pandey have gone back. They've used the information, and to Irfan's credit, I know they are digitizing the records, the indentured records. So it will be easy, right? When I went to Suriname, all of the documents are online. You can sit anywhere in the world and trace your ancestors. So I'm hoping we get to a point. So what is the point to all of this? You know what they say about history, right? History is part of us. It defines who we are, and we can't escape from it. So it is incumbent upon all of us to be able to tap into that historical experience, because our lineage is there, right? And so that's, I know I'm talking for a long time, but that's in a nutshell why I do what I do, and I think it's important that we do this.
Akash?
Mr. Ramharak, I want to ask you, from independence to now, how far have we come as a country, and are you proud where we are?
Well, I can say this today, that we are in a good place, right? We are in a better place. We are blessed, with the oil resource we have. It was traumatic, 2020. Before 1992, Freddie can tell you, we were engaged. We did an opinion poll, and we did a lot of things, right? We were involved wherever we were. Guyana was always in our mind. But we are we are in a better place today in terms of the economy. Anywhere you go, you're seeing development, you're seeing highways, you're seeing a road being constructed. But I know Guyanese have a tendency to complain about everything. Every little thing they can complain and cuss and fight up. But that's in nature of our culture. But you're seeing the development, and I get the sense, even from compared to previous trips that I've been on, I see a sense of people feeling that, okay, things are much better, and that, you know, economic wealth is going to trickle down. I see roads being built, highways are being connected. I'm happy to know that, you know, Berbice, where I'm from, has always been a county that's been neglected. Escobar, I guess, also. They're building that bridge from the quarantine across to Suriname. So the development is there. You know, folks outside, they look at social media, they get information. I know quite a few people who have come back here to invest in the economy. And I know it's a struggle for a lot of people who have been out for a long time to come back and get acclimated, but I see a lot of that happening. And I do think that diaspora can play a role, you know, whoever lives outside, because we have more Guyanese outside than living here. And they have a tremendous amount of skills. Like I have a brother, for instance, who was a chemist. He was a president for a major American company, and he wants to make a contribution. I'll give you an example, something that I think is interesting. You know, he understands how to come back to history again. I don't mean to divert, but he's working with people who can do DNA testing, right? And if I was to take a sample of your blood and I'm testing your DNA, we can trace going back to generations. Like, you know, my family used to work in sugar cane, right? And they used to use certain kind of chemical like potassium sulfate, you know, potassium, whatever. So those chemicals that they use, you can look at the structure of the DNA and you can tell which chemical may have been cause some deformation, right? And people have said, you know, there were other things that may have happened to those people who work in the sugar industry, but technology now can give us an insight into history so we can learn about that. But to answer your question, I am optimistic. I think we've gone through a phase. You know, there's some dark history here. You know, from independence, or you could say 64, to 92, but I think we're going to recover, but some serious damage has been done. And if I may, if you want me to go in that direction, we have to also reflect, because you can't learn and go forward unless you reflect on you know, what you've been through. And one of the things, and I don't mean to be critical here, I'm appreciative of the fact that we're seeing that, you know, you can take out, you can jettison words like Marxist-Leninism and so on. But we also have to look at the consequences, right? You can't just say it was a mistake and say, okay, well, you got to look at things in context, right? But there are some consequences, decisions that were made. We can talk about that if you want, that cause additional headaches, right? And some things which I think could have been, you know, maybe handled in a different way. But to summarize what I said, I think we're in a good place today. I'm very optimistic. I wish more can be done to kind of bring the nation together, you know, as we move on. But I think that's going to come. You do have some people who will say, no matter what you do, you know, nothing is going to be satisfactory, but to them. But I think more young people today, in a sense, more connected. They might be. I don't have. I'm just based on this on anecdotal evidence, right? You know, we've had generations, and I know you talk about what's going on in the Middle East a lot, but you look at people who are involved in the Middle East, are generational issues they're dealing with. So it's not easy to get them out of that frame of mind, right? Like I can tell you, my mother, if she was alive, she would say, don't go to Wisma, right? So that's built in your head. But as you get older, you learn, well, you know, they were little, you know, they were not au fait, and it's not that fair that you have to live with. That things are different, and I think with time, people are seeing the changes, and it's going to be a process. Again, Guyana is not a highly developed country, right? But we are on a trajectory. Walt Rostow talks about the stages of economic development, but he was talking about the European countries and America that develop in stages. Now, we have had the plane taking off. We took a nosedive, but I think we're on a trajectory, and I see that progressing, right? We're not in that happy place, that nirvana. And I think that culture is changing gradually, but there will always be people who are going to be the naysayers. And I think coming out of 2020, I think it sends two messages. One is that it creates a level of bitterness between the both sides, right, involved in that conflict among some people, I would say. But it also sets an example of something we can look back on and make sure it doesn't happen again.
I'm not sure if my wife is going to read your book on Wisma. I will have to persuade her, but I doubt she will read it. That's because her cousin was murdered in Wisma. The family, my wife's parents lost a close one, and my wife, as a little girl, knew the cousin. So it has painful memories for us, and she's not a historian.
But again, I
will have to read it, but it's going to be
But I want to emphasize it's not a narrative that seeks to project some people as evil or seek to project another group of people as being victims. I think there are lessons to be learned here, and hopefully some kind of discussion can come out of that. But more importantly for me, I think the voices of those people has to be unsilenced. I give you that quotation. It seems like God has forgotten about us. That person was telling me a message. Well, we're not looking for, revenge or whatever. The point is, my story has to be told, like everything else. And I think that has to be recognized. That is an important element of what we do, right? Because I think that has been silenced. And for good reasons, people don't want to go back into that. And as we were talking on the way here in the car, they were tit for tat here, all those things were happening. But that specific event, like I can tell you when they have
it was terrible.
The commemoration So if you're gonna have a commemoration for Son Chapman, again, those two events are a terrible tragedy. At least mention that there were some things that happened.
Some things?
Well, but a lot of things for May 24, 20, and Chetty had said he had objected to the date for independence, right? He said, that's a slap in the face of those people who suffered on that day. So that, look, and again, these are some questions that trouble me. Like, I can tell you the first person who was killed, and again, irony, a fellow named Richard Khan, who was 18, a PYO member. We know about Christina Ramjatan and so on, who was a senator and all, and her father was killed, right? But Richard Khan, they used to live in a place called Valley of Tears.
Yeah, I know,
and he was killed by people who he had met a few days before, who had asked for cigarettes at a cinema called Crescent. Crescent is on the other side, or Mackenzie, right? The same people in broad daylight who took we call a palaver post, a stave, and beat the heck out of him, while the other brother was watching it. That brother was so traumatized that he wrote some poetry, which I have, and I'm going to use that as an introduction. But the point is these people's stories. I know it's in the the COI. I was looking at Harold Drayton was a member of the commission. And he has some interesting things because he made his donation. That's a fellow who Chetty brought back here to set up UG.
He has his autobiography.
It's a big fat book, and he said he gave all of his papers. That's how I know it's in the archive. Nobody seems to know that, but it's there because I looked at the whole box. And the important thing is, in the COI, he has some notes in red and blue ink, right? But it gives you an idea what they were thinking. So this would be like part of the stenograph. So what were they thinking because we have the commission, so we want to know what was going through their mind, right? So again, it comes back to the whole idea that the story of these people has to be told, even though it's traumatic as it is. I mean, if Chetty could call it a massacre, Janet, Holocaust.
Your description is ethnic cleansing.
I'm thinking, and
that will be in the book. You will refer to it as an episode of that will be the first in the
but I'm hoping
third world.
Right.
There's Rwanda, there's Biafra in Nigeria, but this is 64.
Let me throw this in. Alyssa Trotz got some funding from the UN, and they were going to look at the violence after 2001, but for whatever reason, they interrogated the victims of WISMA, blacks, Indians, mixed, and so on. David Hines was also one of the interviewer because David happened to be in the country at that time.
So Alyssa Trotz got some money, and she did investigation of WISMA and employed David Hines.
David happened to be in the country.
What year was that?
I think it was 2008. I can send that to you.
And she didn't reach out to some people who were documenting Indian history, like yourself, like
Well, I don't think I'm that well known, Freddie. You just said.
No, 2008. You've been writing letters in the papers and was part of Jihad, G-I-H-A.
Yeah.
Is that right? Shit.
But
you're being modest.
Let me
you're
make
being
this
modest.
before I forget.
Alyssa Trotz had to know about you.
Right, and I think that a part of that study, Red Thread was involved in that, by the way. The woman came from.
I'd like to see the conclusion of that study. Red Thread, David Hines, Alyssa Trotz documenting Indian victimhood in WISMA.
They published a book.
BAYTORAM RAMHARACK, please.
Well, it's in that book on Ande. Right?
Andaya.
So, and it's there. And here's the interesting thing.
The point is to change
Alyssa,
the world.
I think she was a key writer. She has the narrative in there that suggests, based on the interview, that people, there were 6 women who were raped. We know 3 of the women came from the same household. Again, according to the commission. But she said that rape. I don't remember the exact words, but it sounded, like rape, as she was saying, was used as a political weapon. So that got me thinking that the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda were using the cutlass, the machete, and rape as weapons. So to me, that's a powerful statement coming from a person, who is not an Indian, but who understood what happened. Now, of course, blacks were also concerned, but I do want to come back to the point that there were Africans who provided assistance at the risk of their own life to Indians who were fleeing, right, at that time and place. So it's important because people have told me that, and they have shared stories, and some names I wouldn't be able to mention in the narrative. But I have people who I've interviewed, and their narrative will be there in that, in that.
But BaytOram, wait a minute. This is a revelation. I don't know. I read every conceivable thing because it's part of my job. I'm a daily columnist. I have to read things. I didn't know the UN had given Alyssa Trotz a grant to do a research. She did it on WISMA. Where is it? It's public money, it's UN money, it's not a private foundation.
Well, some of it is published in that book on Andaya, so, but I can get that.
Change the world.
Yes, it's in there. And Andaya, people may not know, her father was the
Frank Williams, the doctor.
Yeah, for Bonham's doctor.
Yeah. But where is this stuff? Is it in the archives? Has it been published?
It's in the book. If you get the book, it's there. I have an article which I can send to you. But the point I'm saying, if other people are writing about it, why can't we even talk about that? So I'm hoping if you're shifting the celebration of independence to come back to 58 years now, you're going to be doing it in Linden. I'm hoping that, at least that could be mentioned, right? Because, I'm launching this book on May 25th. It will be incumbent upon me to mention something about that, But if you're celebrating in that place where this happened, and again, I'm asking the people who are involved, would you consider mentioning, you don't have to go into details, but the point is that's where it happened. And that's it's a national stain, like the first time in the Caribbean that has ever happened. So maybe that's a question you may want to put to the people who you know.
But Akash will come in. So I wanted to talk more about ethnic cleansing in the third world as early as 1964. But Akash?
Yeah, let's go back a little. I watched a BBC documentary called The Making of a Prime Minister, the Rigged Elections of the PNC, where one of the journalists said, and I quote, "To call it an election is to give it a name it does not deserve. It was a seizure by fraud, not an election." I was born in 1975, and in my wildest dreams, I mean, I was told about these things, but I was not, in my wildest dreams, I never thought that this particular bit of history would have been repeating itself right before my eyes in the modern world in 2020. Because let me read the quote again. It says, "To call it an election is to give it a name it does not deserve. It was a seizure by fraud, not an election." And after 50 years, when this documentary was filmed, I experienced this again. And it's mind-boggling that history to this nature has repeated itself, because you spoke of that we had some tough times and some bad times and all of that. What are your thoughts, Mr. Ramharak?
Well, hopefully, sometimes trauma, can keep you thinking, and hopefully you want to. By the way, before I forget, I was talking about Valley of Tears, where Richard Cann was killed. He probably the first person. That name, just like how that area has been changed, and that the name of Valley of Tears has changed to Harmony Valley, right? Which is irony about, from Valley of Tears. I think it's called
It's like if you're obfuscating history.
Yeah, exactly. And we can talk about Prashad Nagar, they try to change the name and so on, as you know. But yeah, and again, the hope is that when you look back on all of these things, and again, this is why I keep saying history is important. You said you were not aware, but you experienced it. That is your lived experience, right? Nobody can tell you otherwise, because they can say, but you were here, you saw it with your own eyes, right? And that's going to be something in your memory now that's going to lead you to make sure that when that event comes around again, to cast that vote, you're going to be more alert, right? So you'll be more aware. And I think that's all of us. And all of us have, gone through 28 years of struggling. You were here, on the ground doing what you need to do. There were people outside who were doing but that's the experience we have to live with. That's our history. And as all history does is it leads you to create mechanisms, put mechanism in place to prevent those traumas, right? And I know you've written about 2020, and rightfully so. You're asking where these people were, what did they do during that process? Because I know in the back of your mind, you want to make sure this doesn't happen again, because you're invested here. You have kids here. Your kids are gonna have kids. There's a future, so we don't want to go back to that past.
You never mind you've lived outside. I'm sure you've heard the word Jumbilash. In common parlance, we talk about. You've been getting some Jumbilashes from Clement Rui on your perspective on Jagan. The last article by him is April in the newspapers. They seem to think that you have got Dr. Jagan's historical role wrongly.
Well, naturally, but that's, again, if you're talking about the dialectics, the Hegelian dialectics, there's thesis and antithesis, and you have conflict, and that leads to a new idea, right? But the thing is, Clement Roye was a guy who used to watch the bicycles at Metropole, I believe. Donald studied, I believe, in Czechoslovakia. It doesn't exist anymore. So they don't have that exposure. I don't mean to be mean. Donald is a very nice guy. I know I've been engaged with him many years. But let me just say this about Chetty. If you were to go into our home in Borbice, everybody have what they call a showcase, first thing you see. You have glasses and cups, and we don't use them. It's there for show.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But in the middle of that, my parents had a black and white picture of Gandhi. Next to that was a black and white picture of a Chetty. But Chetty's picture was different because he had a prominent mala around his neck.
That's not on the cover of his book, The Western Trial. There's a at that time it was called East Germany. There's an East German version of the book, Seven Seas publication.
Yeah. That because
literally has a mall.
Right, it's the Indian thing, right? If your fan was to come to goes to Burmese, they will put that on his neck, right? So it's a sign of respect. If Chetty was to say, "Look, I am a saint," the entire world would respect that because he was incorruptible, as everybody know. He was a genuine guy. He's a fellow who will go to Esquivo, roll up his sleeves, pull his pants up, walk through the mud, and go into a dilapidated house and sit on a pirha, as they say, and have a conversation with you, which will make sense. Now, he wouldn't talk about Marxism and so on there, but it will make sense, and he will make you understand, how your situation can be improved. So he took us out of the logie, right? He did a lot for us. His government from 57 to 61 was very, very progressive. As a Barbitian, we can't forget Black Bush Polo and so on. Giving us, expanding the franchise. So all of those things, yes, we have to praise him for that. And he was charismatic. I guess you could say, he's as charismatic as Barnum was for Africans. But for me, Chetty was a very powerful figure. You could not say anything negative about Chetty. That's how we grew up, right? But as we're historians and we're a little, I don't want to say smarter, but we're now more aware. So we can analyze, and criticism doesn't necessarily mean, that we're trying to bring him down. He's going to be on that pedestal, right? As long as we're alive. Because we always remember, because this is also part of our lived experiences, right? Gorbachev couldn't have become Gorbachev. He became Gorbachev because that generation that led that revolution were gone, right? It was a new generation, so he emerged. So we can be critical, and one of the things that I've said, he's been a little bit naive about, all of us were Marxists, right? We were thinking about how we can chain ourselves to the White House and not get arrested and talk about free and fair election in Guyana and whatever. But the thing is, I think the problem was when you become totally aligned with the Soviet Union. Most third world leaders were Marxist oriented, right? But when you tore that line, and I think once he got into that frame, he totally accepted Marxism as the only solution. And then being aligned, and then there were people who I know, like when I write about Chetty, I don't give my opinion per se. I'm quoting people who knew him, who worked with him, and his own words, because I know nobody is ready to be critical about Chetty. But again, I don't want to sound like I'm highly critical. I'm saying, he did a lot of good for all of us, and I think we have to respect that. So there's a legacy that's there, but we also have to acknowledge that he was a bit naive in certain things, and the other point I think is important for me to make is that I know people are saying, look, and I agree with this, that, jettisoning of Marxist-Leninism and, socialism and so on. But when we talk about those things, we also have to talk about the consequences of what they caused. There were tremendous, problems that came with that, in the sense that entire generations had to migrate. WISMA, we talk about WISMA, was you could put that in the framework of the Cold War, foreign intervention, but all of those things were also, in a sense, directly connected or indirectly, right? People had to leave, families were going backtrack and so on. And then, you can mama-guide all you want, as they say in Trinidad, but critical support was a problem. When you're doing that 2 years after the most, rigged election in 73, and then because you now become an enabler, right? And I pointed this out in Rohi. I don't think Rohi is that intellectual to understand what I'm saying. If you read his book,
That's a bit harsh.
it's a bit harsh, but you know, Rohi, if you're watching, I'm not saying this out of disrespect, or Donald. I know you're in England, Donald, but I do respect, but I do, you know, challenge some of the things. So he has a thing in there, and you know, where those people who were, in a sense, who made their wealth, were wealthy, were seen as pariahs. And that's what the class thing also does, right? It's great to be concerned about the working class and continue with that, because we want to lift everybody up. But they have that word, you know, Clement used that word, the Indian bogey, when Indians talk about their own interests. So if I'm writing about, you know, Indian folks, he may consider me to be the same without understanding, you know, what we're trying to do and documenting that history.
Okay, Akash?
I have a keen interest in indentureship and slavery and all of that. You know, I try my. I feel that we owe those people who bled and died for this country. We owe them something. How do we honor those people, Mr. Ramharak? How do we really do something in this country that? Because when our foreparents left wherever they came from, and not forgetting the people who were living here, the first people, the Amerindians too, because they suffered. And strange, yes, the Africans coming here during slavery, the Indians coming here, strange place, you know, it's totally different. But they call this place home. And they, as we say in Guyanese, they band their belly and said we're gonna do something. This is our home now. And look where we are today, you know. But what can we do to honor those people?
Well, Freddie, we can start, and Akash, we can start by putting the word Indian in Indian Arrival Day, and which we know was the PPP parliamentarians who took it out. That's you know, they do it. See, I call those Indians who came, I use the word Girmitia. I think people like Bazde Mangru and others use the word Jahaji, which really means a ship. But Girmit was Gandhi had used that word. It means a contract. So that you can't just look at the experience on the ship. It's what happened before on the ship and on the plantations, because the contract didn't end when you come off the ship, right? So I'm using that word Girmitian, and you will see that in my narrative. So, so some people will say, well, look, you know, yes, I know some people say, okay, we came here and look at where we are today. We've moved on. Yeah, that's a good thing, right? It's a great thing. And one of the things we can also do is look back on the history, right? And those who came here have done tremendous work. They really built, you know. Some people may be upset with me saying this, but it was Reverend Cropper who said if Indians were not here, this place would be like a mangrove, you know, swamp. I don't think he really mean that Indians were alone, you know, contributed to the development of Guyana, but we know what he was saying. And of course, you have others who have talked about the Indian spirit, you know, people like Harry Prashad and so on. So opportunities were created, right? Because we came here. So some people will appreciate the fact that we're here. You know, I'm a third generation, you know, parents have been then, you know, I'm the third in terms of that line of people who came here. But I think it's also important that we recognize where we came from, because we can't, you know, as James Baldwin says, history is part of us. We can't wish it away. It defines who we are. And I think there are lessons to be learned in history, right? If you go back, so we can take some of those moments, right? And I can tell you, you know, Kumar is here in the studio with us. He has done shows where he has interviewed people, and I've done it too with my father, you know, who have traced their ancestors back. They've gone back to the village where they're from. I mentioned Irfan. I think Jack Day was also done that. So that connection, you know, you can make that connection. So it's a great cultural feeling to be able to do that. Right now, some people will say, well, that's in the past, it's history. But yeah, it happened in the past, but there's a connection there. It helps us define who we are when you have a true sense of understanding who you are and that historical experience, right?
Let's look at this book, but before you this is your latest book, the story of Harry Persaud, the man who built Persaud Nagar. But one of the things I noticed about this book, look at the spectacles Harry Persaud is wearing. It's rimless. Now, I did not know that before the 90s it was in fashion. I thought this rimless spectacles came in around the 90s. But when was this photograph taken?
I don't know the exact year, but I got that from the family, as you know.
So rimless spectacles was around a very long time. But let's talk about your latest book.
Yeah.
Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK is in Guyana to launch two of his many books. The biography of the wife of this man, Jang Bahadur Singh, Alice Bhagwandan Singh. He's launching this book, and the founder of Persaud Nagar. So he'll talk about Harry Persaud. And one thing I want to ask BAYTORAM is if he had the good fortune of interviewing Harry Persaud's son-in-law, who passed away a few months ago, the Court of Appeal judge.
Yeah.
Did you interview him?
I did. I know he wasn't feeling well, and his daughter, who lives in Canada, would come down here. By the way, Harry Persaud wrote an autobiography, which is not well known, and I've included that here. So I've added 4 chapters to create the scenario for him. But you mentioned Harry, Prem Persaud married Harry's daughter. Yeah, the oldest daughter, Chandra. Prem Persaud shared a story with me, and again, this is why he was ill and so on. He told me that. Well, 2 things, but I'm going to give you one of them that he mentioned. He said when the mayor of Georgetown, a fellow named Meredith Ford, Guyana was, become a republic and whatever, they were trying to change the name to be reflective of, I guess, local culture. So part of High Street, leading to the public buildings, I believe, was renamed Avenue of the Republic, right? So Meredith Ford didn't know much about Persaud Nagar, so he wanted to change the name Persaud Nagar. Now that would have totally wiped out everything Harry represented. He was a very cultured person. He built a lot of schools for people. He was very generous in what he was doing, and what I admired about him is he was bold enough to name every street, in that area that he built. Right? This was a swampland, right, owned by Bookers. 77 acres. The plan was to build 400 houses. So he built that, and he had some thinking that went through, right? So he even had a name. There's a Cherry Street, by the way.
Is it true that Jagan facilitated the land? I've been told as Premier of Guyana.
Jagan may have helped, and I think Janet may have also helped at that time. But the point is, in his autobiography, I have to go with what he's saying, right? Everything was pretty much on his own, but it's a remarkable story about him, right? I'm going to come back to Meredith Ford in a minute. He made a decision, right, to leave in 1952, to leave Guyana, because he was fascinated with Gandhi and what was happening, like most of the intellectual Indians in the early 1900s. Took his entire family, his wife, Amla, to live. But they came back the fall in 53. That's when he built Persaud Nagar, because he had that skill. He was a guy who used to sell wood, firewood, go out in the interior and so on, and he worked his way up. But to come back to Meredith and Prem Persaud, so now Ford obviously didn't understand the cultural, baggage and so on that went into creating this. Well, I don't want to say baggage, but the cultural elements that went into creating and what Harry Persaud had done. So he wanted to change the name. I don't know what he wanted to change it to, but when Prem Persaud got hold of that information, he went to see Barnum. And he explained to Barnum that this is a private housing scheme. You have no right to change the name. So Barnum picked up the phone and called Meredith Ford and says, listen, they got a place named Persaud Nagar. I want to know that as long as I'm alive, that name is not changed.
You see how when we started this program, we said these programs will contribute to Guyana's historiography. This is the first time we're hearing about this.
So Prem Persad and Bonham, both of them saved the day.
The Guyanese know him by another name rather than Meredith Ford. Mayor Ford, he has another name, a more popular name.
I don't know what the other name was, but he left, and then I think he may have passed away in Maryland. But there's also...
So he wanted to change, but...
He wanted to change the name.
Of all the places, why was this anti... Because he belonged to the mulatto Creole class. Was it an anti-Indian thing?
I don't know if he was anti-Indian, but I know to be able to take a village, well, it's an urban village, right? And change the name without understanding, or, you know, this guy had a name, you know, Delhi Street, the way we used to live, lot 9 and 10. Opposite was Prem Persad. And everything was, this is the first time in the history of Guyana where someone was that bold to do that, because he was culturally oriented, and he talked about how he learned Hindi. And when he went to India, he looked at the way things were, you know, were being built. He mentioned in his autobiography something important, which is called a green belt. As you know, in Europe, they have a sort of a green belt around the cities to prevent urban sprawl, right? So a city doesn't encroach further out, right? To keep it confined in a certain area. In the United States, for instance, they don't want the bad things about the city coming out into the suburbs. So he had all that in his mind, right? And he was concerned about flooding and so on, because he saw a lot of that. But obviously he couldn't control what happened outside. So his green belt was really the boundaries of Prashad Nagar. And I'm sure he loved his wife so much that he named 2 avenues after her, Amla, Devi, East and West. And like I said, he named a street after a guy named Jairam Bisesar.
Yeah, I know Bisesar Street. That's perhaps one of the most popular streets.
Yeah, he may have been the first Indian gynecologist, don't quote me on that. But Bisesar was also a ship doctor when the MV Resurgent left and the last ship went back to India in 1955. He was one of the guys who inspected. Bisesar, by the way, in 1953 was Barnum's competitor. And Chetty obviously would have supported Barnum against Bisesar. But, you know, that's the history of it. But there is another story, and I don't think we have time for that.
No, we have 2 minutes more.
Yeah, there's another street that was changed, and you know, Prem Persad had written about that. But it's a long story.
No, please, we have 2 minutes more. This is history. This is going to go into Guyana's historiography.
The street, he named the street Kaka. Now, if you're not Indian and you're not au fait with the culture, you may think Kaka is a bad word. It's from a Creole perspective, right? But for us, it really refers to cha-cha. Right, which is your uncle or whatever. So that's the Indian element. So there was a street that he named. People don't know that that street was named after a guy named Kaka Saheb Khalilkar, right? This was an Indian revolutionary from India who worked with Gandhi, was in jail. I think he was from the state of Maharashtra, and he translated a lot of the work, you know, written by my name escaped me at that time, but he was very prolific. Who's who won the Nobel Prize in India? Rabindranath Tagore, right?
Oh, the poet.
Yeah. So the name of that street was changed, but he named that, and it was changed because people from Omai were staying there. So I guess they don't know the meaning of Kaka, which means.
So what was the street changed to?
Because the Omai people, it eventually became called Omai Street. Again, it's a silent.
In Prashad Nagar,
yes.
Omai Street?
Right. So Kaka was now changed to Omai because the people who work were, So that became like the name of. So, you know, he would have had problem with that because again, this guy was a revolutionary. He came here in 1958. Was a guest of Hari Prasad.
So did the government of Guyana change, or the city council? Who was the mayor then? Kaka Street to Omai, but they could have given it a guy Omai.
It may have been a sort of unofficial thing, change, because that wasn't mentioned in the original. But Hari explained why. Well, his family and Prem Persad had written something about that, right? He had written a letter in Stabrook News, and then what he had told me, he doesn't understand why that could change. And there was another attempt. And, Prashad Nagar, by the way, people like Mohammed Shahabuddin used to live there.
Yeah. Quite a number.
George Walcott,
Oh, yeah, the vice. Quite a number.
Yeah, and Guyanese Persaud. Mohammed used to have a chicken farm. I don't know if he put the chicken in, and this is before he became a judge.
We gotta go. We have your closing remarks. Akash, thanks for being with us as usual. Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK, prolific writer, is here to launch 2 books. Alice Bhagwandin Singh, wife of the Guyanese icon Jung Bahadur Singh, and the founder of Prashad Nagar. BAYTORAM, I've known you for so long, late 80s, but I still will, for Portugal. Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK, just briefly, what would you like to say to our viewers? We have a large viewership in the diaspora.
Well, I come back to what I said before about history. History is important for us to recognize. And I'm not trying to be, I hope I don't sound arrogant about this, but from a lot of people I know don't understand or are aware of the kind of history that we have. And I think that it's important to be aware.
No, there's nothing arrogant about that. We're not aware of our history in this country.
Yeah, I always say we have to participate in the writing of our history because it brings a certain passion. People will say, well, that's, you might be biased, but the point is that can be verified by what you write because it's the methodology that you use in putting those history together.
Before we go, are you a practicing Hindu?
I am a Hindu. You could say I am a practicing Hindu, but I do as much as I can because life, is so difficult. But in my head, I can't say I go to Mandir every week, but I understand the importance of being an Indian. I understand the importance of India. I understand the importance.
Well, you've certainly written about the importance of being Indian. You've certainly written the past 25 years and ran into controversy. Listen, how do you say thank you in Sanskrit or in Hindi?
Dhanyavad.
Professor RAMHARACK, Dhanyavad.
Dhanyavad. And shukriya, some people would say too. So I appreciate both of you.
What is shukriya?
Thank you. Thank you.
Shukriya.
Shukriya.
Thanks for being with us. Our guest was prolific historian and social scientist BAYTORAM RAMHARACK, Professor BAYTORAM RAMHARACK of the United States, but Guyanese in his heart. Thanks for being with us. Happy Independence Day. We'll see you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.